A cochlear implant is a surgically implanted electronic device that provides a sense of sound to a person who is profoundly deaf or severely hard of hearing. Cochlear implants may help provide hearing in patients who are deaf because of damage to sensory hair cells in their cochleas. These sensory cells never regenerate, unlike most cells in the body. Cochlear implants replace the input of those lost or damaged hair cells to replicate the different frequencies and amplitudes of sound. Implants can augment hearing sufficiently to improve understanding of speech and environmental sounds. Although the quality of sound is different from natural hearing and the input subject to different neural regulation, newer devices and processing strategies allow recipients to hear better in noise, enjoy music, and even use their implant processors while swimming. As of December 2012, approximately 324,000 people worldwide have surgically implanted cochlear implants. In the U.S., roughly 58,000 adults and 38,000 children are recipients. Some recipients have bilateral implants to allow for stereo sound. However, barriers such as the cost of the device prevent many patients from acquiring the device. Long-term auditory therapy following implantation is often required for patients to accurately interpret the sound waves from the device. History. Introduction. Any history of the cochlear implant must start with an overview of non-surgical treatments proposed in the 18th century to overcome the social and psychological consequences of total neonatal deafness. The story begins in the early 18th century. Although the Frenchman Abbé de l'Épée did not actually invent sign language, he did at least bring together the results of various experiences, notably those in Spain, before standardizing and teaching this method with the aim of facilitating communication among all those who practice it, whether deaf or not. Abbé de l'Épée was the first to use sign language to promote the mental development and education of deaf children. In the middle of the 18th century, he created a free public school, which survived the French Revolution and was perpetuated by the nascent republic in the form of the National Institute for Deaf Mutes. This institute, now called the National Institute for Young Deaf People, has always been located in Rue Saint-Jacques, Paris. For many years it was recognized internationally as a leader in the education of deaf children, but its teachers and physicians disagreed on certain teaching methods. The teachers tended to prefer oralization, while the physicians opted for sign language. In fact, this disagreement concerned not only communication itself but also the very place of deaf people in society. Sign language favored the teaching and development of deaf people within their own community, while oralization sought to integrate deaf people into the rest of society. Towards the end of the 19th century, the development of international transport and the medical discipline internationalized the debate. Early cochlear implants in adolescents and adults who had been deaf since birth met with failure, often abandoned by their users. These failures largely accounted for the widespread opposition of the deaf community to this new therapeutic approach. Animal experiments subsequently showed that the auditory system could mature with chronic cochlear implant stimulation, but only if they started to be stimulated within an early period after birth. Early cochlear implantation in children and the corresponding maturational processes ignited in their brains support such concept. Electrical stimulation of afferent auditory pathways became feasible in the last half of the 20th century. Chronologically, its development can be divided into three periods: basic research and early human trials. Development of multi-channel implants in 4 countries, ending in a consensus on the best approach. The modern era. Basic research in 1961. G. von Békésy received the Nobel Prize for demonstrating that sounds trigger vibrations of the basilar membrane which spread from the base to the apex of the cochlea in the form of longitudinal waves. Peaks occur at various points depending on the frequency. resembling the keys of a piano, with low frequencies towards the apex and high frequencies towards the oval window. The terms cochlear keyboard and cochlear tonotopy are often used to describe these phenomena. In 1968, Davis described the physiology of auditory receptors. In 1972, N.Y. Keung unraveled the physiology of electrical stimulation of the inner ear. In 1975, F. Evans showed that each sensory afferent fiber of the cochlear nerve handles a specific frequency, making it electively sensitive to a very narrow frequency band. First human trials. Grandeur and limitations of the single-channel implant. In 1957, Journo, a Parisian professor of medical physics, and C. Eries, a Parisian otologist, restored hearing to a deaf patient with total bilateral cholesteatomas by electrically stimulating acoustic nerve fibers still present in the inner ear. This result was fortuitous, however. Journo and Eries had in fact been seeking to remobilize the frozen facial traits of a patient with cholesteatomas in both ears, which had been complicated, probably many years previously, by bilateral facial paralysis. They failed in the primary goal but had the wherewithal to record their electroacoustic observations over several weeks and to publish them in the French journal Presse Médicale. They stopped their experiment when the apparatus broke down after less than a month. If these French researchers had not noted their unexpected findings, William House might never have dared try to compensate total deafness, which is all the more severe when bilateral. In 1961, a patient gave William House, a Californian otologist, a copy of a Los Angeles Times article describing the work of the Paris researchers. House had already transformed the functional outcome of cerebellopontinar angle surgery by making use of the first surgical microscopes developed in the late 1950s, and was familiar with total deafness. He resumed his research, basing his indications on what was known at the time about the physiology of hearing, a rapidly progressing field, at least in animals. House standardized the surgical procedure and stably positioned the stimulatory electrode by threading it through the round window in the cochlear channel. He encountered a number of difficulties, especially in sealing the implant. Solutions emerged with the advent of pacemakers, but it took House almost 10 years to develop a single-channel cochlear implant. This ultimately robust and simple device stimulated the whole set of the auditory nerve fibers simultaneously, meaning that the recipient was able to recognize only the rhythms of the speech. House marketed his device jointly with J. Urban and continued to implant it until at least 1965. The system was sufficiently reliable for researchers and otologists to overlook its mediocre functional performance. In 1966, B. Simmons performed the first temporary human implantation of a multi-channel system in the trunk of the auditory nerve itself, in a deaf volunteer. This experimental work showed that stimulation of limited quotas of the auditory nerve fibers generated sensations of different frequencies depending on the origin of the stimulated fibers on the cochlear keyboard. Shortly afterwards, Mr. Merzenich confirmed these findings in macaques, using a different approach. In 1967, Clark in Melbourne created a team to conduct basic research on the pathophysiology of profound deafness in animals and on the tolerability of implanted materials. In 1973, Michelson chronically implanted a deaf man with an experimental multi-channel implant. This device used pairs of antennas for each channel, one transmitting and one receiving. It was possible to measure several parameters and to test various types of stimulation, including both bipolar and unipolar. In 1973, C.H. Chouard had extensive personal experience of petrous bone surgery involving the vestibular and facial nerves. Together with P. MacLeod, a close friend specializing in sensory physiology, Chouard decided to create a multidisciplinary team at the ENT Research Laboratory of Saint Antoine Teaching Hospital in Paris. In 1975, the two men showed, in several patients with total unilateral traumatic deafness and facial paralysis, that electrical stimulation of 8 to 12 electrodes, isolated from one another and placed in different parts of the scala tympani, allowed the recipients to perceive different frequencies. Then, having developed a test to ensure that auditory fibers were still present and functional, the Paris team implanted their electrodes in patients with long-standing total bilateral deafness. After a relatively brief period of post-operative speech therapy, all the patients were able to recognize a variable percentage of words without lip reading. Under the scientific direction of P. MacLeod, industrial production of an implantable functional device was entrusted to the Bettine, a French company. A tabletop prototype was quickly built, but the untimely death of Jean Bettine in late 1975 led to restructuring of the company, and it was only in the summer of 1976 that the French researchers finally received the first 6 devices. In the meantime, other French teams launched their own research programs, particularly in the area of the electrodes bearer, but they were forced to abandon their efforts. In 1975, Berin in Vienna, building on the long tradition of the Viennese ant school, launched the development of the first Austrian implant. His work on single-channel intra- and extracochlear stimulation, and then on multi-channel stimulation, was pursued by his pupil Hochmar de Soyer and her husband Professor Hochmar of Innsbruck. Their work culminated in 1982 with the Austrian Medel implant. Technological evolution and competition leading to a consensus on the best approach. The first implant took place at St. Antoine Hospital, Paris, on Wednesday, the 22nd of September 1976. It was performed by C.H. Chouard, assisted by Bernard Mayer. The patient recovered his hearing the following day, and another 5 patients were quickly implanted despite the bulky nature of the transmitter. On the 16th of March 1977, Bettine filed patent No. 77-07824, based on the physiological criteria of MacLeod and making 2 simultaneous claims. 1. Sequential transmission to the cochlea of an indeterminate number of frequency bands, and 2. Transmission of all the sound information. The first results were presented at the 11th World ENT Conference in Buenos Aires, and were quickly published. For nearly 20 years, this document influenced all the procedures and approaches used by other international teams, who were obliged to find ways around the patent claims, usually by opting to transmit only a portion of the speech information, until the patent fell into the public domain in 1997. On 3 November 1977, the team of G. Clark filed a patent for a system with 3 functional electrodes but using only a limited part of the speech information. In 1975, Ingeborg and Erwin Hochmar started cochlear implant development at the Technical University of Vienna. 1977, the world's first microelectronic multi-channel cochlear implant developed by Ingeborg and Erwin Hochmar was implanted in Vienna by Professor Kurt Berrien. The implant had 8 channels, a stimulation rate of 10.000 pulses per second per channel and 8 independent current sources and flexible electrode for 22 to 25 mm insertion into the cochlea. Professor Kurt Berrien inserted the flexible electrode through the round window into the scala tympani. In December 1977, the Austrian team implanted a multi-channel system with sufficient flexibility to study responses to various manipulations of the sound signal. September 1978 saw the first international teaching seminar on cochlear implants held in Paris and attended by representatives of the other 3 involved countries, namely I. Hochmar de Soyer and E. Hochmar, Patrick Michelson and R. Schindler. In 1978, Graham Clark implanted his first patient. In fall of 1979, a patient implanted in August 1979 with a device by Ingeborg and Erwin Hochmar received a small body-worn speech processor. It was modified in March 1980, at which time the patient became the first person to show open-set speech understanding without lip reading using a portable processor. In 1982, Chouard, employing the Born reconstruction technique which he had previously used in his neuroanatomical research together with C. Eries, was the first to demonstrate in animals the need for early implantation to avoid the atrophy of the central auditory structures that occurs very rapidly in case of persistent neonatal deafness. In 1982 the new Bettine device, CORIMAC 12, was presented. It had 12 electrodes and a smaller transmitter but was still much larger than the Australian and Austrian devices. A few years later, after announcing the arrival of the all-digital device that Chouard and MacLeod had been demanding since 1980, Bettine abandoned the field and sold its license to another French company, MXM Neuralec, in 1987. Bettine filed for bankruptcy in 1998. In 1983, the second International Conference on Cochlear Implants was held in the former Paris Faculty of Medicine, just before the annual meeting of the International Collegium. In 1984, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved the Australian implant for use in adults. In 1985, the Australians improved on their original device 35, which now transmitted all the vowel information. In 1990, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved the Australian implant for young children. In 1990, Ingeborg and Erwin Hochmeyer started their company Med-El based in Innsbruck, Austria and hired their first employees. 1 year later, the company presented the world's first behind-the-ear audio processor. In 1991, MXM Neuralec presented their first multi-channel implant based on the Bettine license. It was fully digitized and could be adapted to an ossified cochlea. From 1992 onwards, the multi-channel cochlear implant gradually gained acceptance in France. Other teams, first in Montpellier and Toulouse, began to implant it. At the same time, the sound processing strategy used by the different cochlear implants gradually adopted technology resembling that described in the Bettine patent, delivering all the sound information in a sequential manner. The American implant who provided the entire information in this way, while avoiding falling foul of the French patent by employing a few clever tricks and restrictions. The Australian device was also improved, providing all the sound information but retaining only the channels containing the maximum energy. This restriction also avoided the Bettine patent claims. In 1994, Med-El presented the world's first electrode array capable of stimulating the entire length of the cochlea to allow a more natural hearing. In 1995, Paris organized the Third International Conference on Cochlear Implants. 1996, Med-El presented the world's first miniaturized multi-channel implant and also had the first bilateral implantation for the purpose of binaural hearing. In 1997, the French license was blatantly copied, leading to Bettine to bring a lawsuit with seizure of the apparatus in question. This was just before the patent fell into the public domain. However, the charges were quickly dropped following protests in some surgical centers. In addition, the cost of the legal proceedings far exceeded any financial retribution the company could expect to obtain. All manufacturers have since applied the principles of the Bettine patent defined by P. MacLeod and C. Chouard. Present following the French National Ethics Committee's approval of screening in the early neonatal period, and the centenary of the work of Abbé de l'Epeacutie, celebrated in 2012 at the initiative of Legend. The positions of the deaf and hearing communities in France have started to be reconciled, in a cordial and respectful dialogue, avoiding proselytism. The two communities are striving to refine the criteria of choice between the cochlear implant and the use of sign language. Both options are sometimes valid. Parts of the cochlear implant The implant is surgically placed under the skin behind the ear. The basic parts of the device include external, one or more microphones which picks up sound from the environment, a speech processor which selectively filters sound to prioritize audible speech, splits the sound into channels and sends the electrical sound signals through a thin cable to the transmitter. A transmitter, which is a coil held in position by a magnet placed behind the external ear, and transmits power and the processed sound signals across the skin to the internal device by electromagnetic induction. Internal, a receiver and stimulator secured in bone beneath the skin, which converts the signals into electric impulses and sends them through an internal cable to electrodes. An array of up to 22 electrodes wound through the cochlea, which send the impulses to the nerves in the scala tympani and then directly to the brain through the auditory nerve system. There are 4 manufacturers for cochlear implants, and each one produces a different implant with a different number of electrodes. The number of channels is not the sole basis upon which a manufacturer is chosen. The signal processing algorithm is another important consideration.